So now that we have the basic UI for the application, the next thing that I want to do is start to create the functionality. Again, what I'm going to be doing in this lecture, you should be very familiar with. I will start by adding a brand new folder that is going to be my models folder. And in here, I am going to create a new class. So I will create a new empty class from the general tab in here that is going to be expense. And my expense is simply going to have one property for each of the entries, or where the entries and the pickers that I have inside of the new expense page. So basically I am going to have the name, the amount, the description, the date and the category, but since we are going to be saving this eventually on a database, a local SQLite database, I am going to be creating an integer property for the ID. Which brings me to the next step, which is precisely to add to the Nuget folder a new package, which is going to be the SQLite package. Now, if you remember, if you have used SQLite before, here we want to find the SQLite-net-PCL package by Frank Krueger, the one that is destined precisely for PCL or now .NET Standard projects that has over 1 million downloads now. And you will have to add this to all 3 projects, or if you're supporting another platform, to all of the projects that you have in here. So I will go ahead and do this for Android and iOS as well. Once I have done that, that means that I will be able to add some SQLite attributes to my model. Starting with the ID, this is going to be the primary key. Of course, to be able to use this, I will need to add some using directive. So I add this using directive to the SQLite namespace. I'm also going to set this to auto increment. And I am going to set the description to have a max length of, let's say, 25 characters. So basically just defining the model in here. Now with the model and the SQLite package added, the next thing that I can do is go ahead and start to implement the functionality or to add the methods that are going to save and read, and basically all of the setup necessary for SQLite. This means 3 things. One, I'm going to need in the app class to define a new static string database path variable and to add a new constructor for the app that is going to receive a string. And this string eventually is going to be assigned to this static variable that I'm defining. So again, something that you are probably familiar with. All I'm doing in here is defining this database path, so eventually I can access it from other pages. Now, to be able to get that database path, I do need some custom functionality or some custom code because Apple has some restrictions as to where this file can be located. So I am simply creating the path in here, and the full path must be passed to the constructor of the app. Of course, we are now going to be using the second overload of the constructor, the one that I have just created. And this is the same for Android. The only difference is that the folder path is going to be slightly different, but the full path has to also be passed through the app constructor. So now from the app, we are already getting that path to where the database is going to be located. With that, we can go ahead and create a couple of view models in here. So I am going to create yet another folder for my view models. And inside of the view models, I will start by creating all of the view models, the 3 classes that I'm going to need in here so far: the categories, the expenses, and the new expense view models. Now let me start with the categories view model. In the categories view model, I would need a list of categories, but my category eventually is simply going to be a string. So in here we could do many different things. What I'm going to do is simply define, because this is going to be a list of strings, a property that is going to be an observable collection of strings that is going to be categories. And what I'm going to have in here is a call from the constructor of a new method that is going to be getting the categories. So from the getCategories method, which I have to create, of course, I will simply add new elements to the categories, or actually the first thing that I have to do is create or initialize the categories variable, and I'm going to be adding some values in here. So simply adding some strings to this categories variable. No big deal in here, again, just an observable collection. Now in the expenses, I do need a bit more information. So in fact, what I'm going to do in here is from the model of the expense class, read and write to the corresponding SQLite database table. So I will have a couple of methods in here. The first one is going to be the insert expense method. All this is going to do is insert into the database. So the first thing that I will need is a SQLite connection in here. And of course, the connection is going to be establishing the connection to that database path that we already have in the app class. Now in here, I will make sure that first the table is created. So I am going to create the expense table. And then that I insert the variable that I'm defining or that I'm receiving inside of this method. And you may remember that the insert method from the SQLite connection class returns an integer. That is exactly what this method is going to be returning as well. And I'm going to need a public. This is, by the way, going to be static, so I don't need an instance of the expense class to be able to do this. And this is actually going to return a list of expenses. And again, all I'm going to do is create a connection, make sure that the table is created, read from it, make the query be converted into a list, and that is exactly what I'm going to be returning. So this means that from the expenses, I will now be able to have an observable collection of expenses as well, of course. I need a couple of using directives in here, and that I am going to be able to get the expenses here. What I'm going to do here is as well create a new getExpenses method. And in this method, what I'm going to do is first get a list by calling from the expense class the getExpenses method. But I cannot simply assign this list to the observable collection, nor can I create a new observable collection because the binding would be lost eventually. What I can do though is execute a for each loop and get each of the expense in the expenses variable and that added to the expenses. So expenses is going to add this expense. And by the way, I should make sure that the expenses is cleared in here. So expenses I'm going to call the clear method, which actually makes me think that in my category I'm doing something wrong because the categories, every time the getCategories method is called, I am initializing the categories observable collection again. I should actually only do this the first time, and instead here the categories should be cleared. So I make this small change. I have the getExpenses in here for the expenses VM. The next functionality that I need is from the new expense to save the expense. Now in here I do need to implement the iNotify property changed interface. If you're not familiar with it, this will simply allow me to get some events to be fired every time the value inside of a property changes. So I will implement that and create some properties so I have a correct binding eventually. So basically this interface is going to create an event. We are going to be creating another property changed method, and each of these properties is going to fire that method when they change, so the event is actually triggered. This again is going to help us with the binding, and I hope you are familiar with this with MVVM and at least with the iNotify property changed. So now the last thing that we need is a method in here that I am not going to yet call, but it's going to be created already. Let's make this public. And this is going to be the insert expense method. This, if you're familiar with MVVM, you may start to notice, will eventually be called from a command. This is the one that will be triggered when we click the save button. So in here, we basically need to create a new expense, and we can right from the beginning set its properties. So the name, for example, is going to be equal to the expense name property that we have, which is a property of this view model. And the same thing for the other variables or properties of this class. We have the amount, we have the category, we have the date, and we have the description. With this expense created, all we have to do is from the expense class, call the insert expense method and pass this expense. So this is the basic functionality for our application. We are already saving, we are already reading, we already have some of the observable collections that we're going to be using from the view models. It is in the next few lectures where we're going to bind everything together. So I just wanted to make sure that we have the functionality, which is pretty straightforward really, and I hope that you find this very straightforward as well. Before we move forward to the next lectures and actually start to see a little bit more in detail what we're going to be doing. Hopefully nothing so far has been too difficult for you. All we have done is define the UI and now define some functionality for saving on a local database by first, of course, adding a package to the project, and now just adding the functionality for reading and saving, and just here setting up a couple of observable collections, some properties here and there. Now, starting in the next lecture, we're actually going to do something more interesting, which is binding the commands. And there I am going to explain in a bit more detail than in these couple of lectures what is going on. In these couple of lectures, I just wanted to set up things. In the next lecture is where the exciting things start to happen.